Welcome. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy and very pleased to be moderating this very important, very timely webinar brought to you by the Center's Middle East Policy Program. We'll be hearing in due course from the man who directs it. His name is Dr. David Wormser. But we have a few other guests that we'll speak to before he comes up. And I simply wanted to say, by way of an introduction to the panel and to the topic of the United States, specifically the Biden administration's intensifying hostility towards not just the government of Israel, the newly established coalition government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu following his successful election campaign of last year, but to the state of Israel itself. I think that's increasingly unmistakable and deplorable. We're going to be talking about why it is not only contrary to the vital interests of the Jewish state for its principal ally, the United States of America, being not only in private difficult and I think counterproductive, but actually hostile, and doing that increasingly in public as well. But also why this is contrary to the interests of the United States itself, to have both our principal ally in the region, certainly our most reliable one, regarded both by the people of Israel themselves, but also by others in the region, as now the object of scorn and criticism, and increasingly the overt expression of anger towards the government of Israel. It is counterproductive in the extreme, and we're going to talk about the knock-on effects that that kind of behavior might have. On the eve of visits to Israel by Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the President's National Security Advisor, and at a moment when there is an awful lot of very dangerous dynamics evident in the region, notably with the government of Iran, but also within the Palestinian community, which now seems to be taking aboard what is the perceived distance between the United States government and that of Israel to heighten tensions with Israel and attacks upon her. To get into all of this, we're very pleased to have with us a marvelous panel that will be led off by our first presenter, Douglas J. Fife, most recently in the course of many years of service in our government, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under the administration of George W. Bush. He is these days a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute and the author of a very impressive memoir of his time in the Pentagon entitled War and Decision. Doug was able to join us by video, and we're very pleased to have him with us. We'll go to the video at this point.
There are two main items on the Biden administration's agenda regarding Israel. One of them is Iran, the other is the Palestinians. And I think that the administration started out thinking that it could get a revival of the Iran nuclear deal and not thinking that prospects were very bright for any kind of deal with the Palestinians. They have now apparently come to the conclusion that they're not likely to get the revival of the Iranian nuclear deal either. So they don't have bright diplomatic prospects. I think they are more realistic than they were at the beginning of the Biden administration. And they've generally, in their public statements, set expectations low. And nobody's thinking that they're going over there with, with the intention to imminently deliver some major breakthrough, either with the Iranians or with the Palestinians. I think the thing that has changed and given the Biden administration officials some energy is the new Israeli government. And the energy that the Biden administration has is negative energy. They want to go over and openly quarrel, it appears, with Bibi Netanyahu. They put out a number of statements as soon as he got elected and as he was forming his government that they're very unhappy with the people that are in his government, and they're going to hold Bibi Netanyahu as the prime minister personally responsible for any bad actions that they anticipate his various right-wing cabinet officials will engage in. And so I think their thought right now is they're not particularly interested in advancing the Iranian or the Palestinian agenda, but they are interested in creating distance between themselves and the Netanyahu government. And their calculation appears to be that since there is a lot of criticism from the center and the left in Israel of the composition of the new Netanyahu government and some of the legislative initiatives that Netanyahu has announced his government is going to be pursuing, President Biden and his team feel comfortable that they can be blasting Netanyahu without being accused of being anti-Israel, because they have a lot of cover from a lot of Israelis who are also blasting the Netanyahu government. Now, this is not in and of itself an enormously significant event. There have been, quarrels and bickering and stuff like that in the past, but I think in this particular case, there's a price that the United States is going to be paying for the Biden administration's apparent decision to quarrel publicly with the Israelis. And the price will be paid, I think, with respect to U.S. relations with the various Arab states in the region. There is a real honest-to-goodness, large, even life and death issue that the Gulf Arabs are concerned about, and that is the Iranian threat. And countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, I think Saudi Arabia also, view the Iranians as a life and death enemy. And they're in what they consider to be an extremely serious conflict with the Iranians. And even though there is undoubtedly a fair amount of sympathy with the Palestinians in general, just because of decades of conditioning and solidarity among Arabs and Muslims that is very familiar to everybody, even despite that, there is a recognition that produced the Abraham Accords, that on the part of the UAE, Bahrain, I think the Saudis also, there's a recognition that in this life and death quarrel that they have with Iran, Israel is a valuable ally of the Gulf Arabs against the Iranians. And it's an ally for what it can do diplomatically for the Gulf Arabs around the world, and especially in Washington. And it's an ally in that the Israelis have real military and intelligence capability and an ability to help the Gulf Arabs defend themselves. And this is something that if the United States doesn't show an appreciation of, is going to damage, I think, the relations that the United States have the relations that the United States conducts with the Gulf Arabs. They are looking to the United States for understanding, for seriousness of purpose, for a common threat assessment. And they don't see it. They see an administration now that actually believed it could make a valuable nuclear deal to revive the old nuclear agreement with Iran. And from their point of view, that showed a lack of judgment. They're probably happy that the administration has said that this is not a priority for the administration, but still the damage to the administration's reputation, its image for acuteness, for understanding, for resolution, I think has been damaged. And the failure to appreciate how important Israel is to the broader regional effort to resist the Iranians also, I think, undermines America's standing in the eyes of the Gulf Arabs. And so it's not really clear to me what the upside of quarreling with Netanyahu is here. I mean, there's another point also that's worth noting, and that is the effect on Palestinian thinking of the United States, picking this fight. The Palestinian political environment is split, as we know. You've got Hamas, the Islamist terrorist organization running Gaza, and you have Mahmoud Abbas and the PLO running the Palestinian Authority. And neither group, I mean, even though the Abbas is considered a relative moderate, compared to Hamas, the fact is neither group has been willing to ever compromise with Israel, resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict on the basis of sharing the territory. I mean, they both essentially have extreme positions. I mean, Hamas may be in some respects more extreme, but it doesn't really make the Palestinian Authority moderate. And they both are, they're both nurturing the hope and promoting among their people the hope that their uncompromising rejection of Israel will someday lead them to victory. And the concept that they have is, they can delegitimate Israel, they can undermine Israel internationally, they can damage and ultimately destroy the relationship with the United States that they believe is a lifeline for Israel. And so anything that gives them encouragement to believe that the United States-Israel connection is one that they can at some point sever, encourages opposition to compromise, opposition to moderation, opposition to anybody within the Palestinian community who favors ending the conflict. And so it really doesn't serve, I don't think it serves America's interests with the Palestinians. I don't think it serves America's interests with the Gulf Arabs. And I don't think it serves the general interests of the United States in a strong and healthy relationship with Israel for the Biden administration to announce more or less out of the blue that just because we don't like the composition of the new Israeli government, we want to go over there and organize a public quarrel.
Doug Feith, thank you. A perfect stage setter for the conversations that we will have next, in which we're going to drill down on some of those, well, negative repercussions of the hostile attitude that the Biden administration is now unmistakably exhibiting towards the new Israeli government. We'll take stock of how all of this is seen from an Israeli perspective with our next presenter. His name is Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. He has had a distinguished career in the foreign service of his nation, Israel. He was, among other things, the former Minister for Congressional Affairs in Israel's embassy in Washington for many years. Also served as the Consul General for its consulate in Houston. He has been the head of the government press office in Israel and is, among other things, the founder of the American Israel Demographic Research Group, which has done some very important forensic analysis on some of the claims about the inevitability of Israel's demise at the hands of a growing Arab population, unless it concedes territory or indeed a state to the Palestinians. He is also the editor of a wonderful newsletter, the Ettinger Report, which I commend to all of you. We're delighted to have you, Mr. Ambassador, with us now stateside, just having flown in from Israel. Thank you for overcoming what I'm sure is the jet lag and fatigue to join us for this really important conversation. And we appreciate your bringing your perspective to bear on the U.S. policy towards the new government of Israel and its implications. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much. In my mind, the threats to Israel have been basically constant as well as unpredictable. That's the nature of the Middle East, and the threats are on our borders. It's within our borders if you think about the Palestinian Authority, and all the way to Iran. However, overriding and exacerbating those threats, in my mind, has been the current U.S. worldview. U.S. worldview, which has shaped U.S. policy in the Middle East and throughout the globe. And the number one threat, I believe, to Israel is the dramatic weakening of the U.S. posture of deterrence in order to minimize global instabilities and very intense Middle East instabilities. In order to minimize those phenomena, the U.S. must possess a very, very effective posture of deterrence, which has been eroded during the last 2-3 years, largely because of the multilateral or cosmopolitan worldview, which has guided the shaping of U.S. policy towards Iran, towards Islamic terrorism in general, towards international terrorism, towards the Saudis, the Egyptians, towards the Palestinians. And this has added fuel to the Middle East fire. And what I refer to specifically is the current policy by the US, which considers Iran's ayatollahs to be potentially good faith negotiators, which conflicts with the track record of the ayatollahs going back to February 1st, 1979, when they officially assumed power in Tehran. The U.S. also, currently, the U.S. believes that the Ayatollahs of Iran are amenable to peaceful coexistence. and to power sharing with neighbors, the Sunni Arab countries, the Sunni Arab pro-American countries. And certainly the US currently believes that in return for a dramatic, very generous diplomatic and financial bonanza to the Ayatollahs would be amenable to abandoning their fanatic 1400-year-old vision, which is not limited to the Persian Gulf, not to the Middle East as a whole, but it is global in nature, and I would say all the way to South and Central America, literally all the way to the US-Mexico border. Part of that policy towards Iran has also been the pressure on the Saudis and the Egyptians, which not only has driven those countries closer to China, closer to Russia, but it has been quite tailwind to America's worst enemies in the Middle East, namely the Ayatollah's regime, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other Sunni terror organization. The same cosmopolitan policy which has espoused coordination with the UN, coordination with the Europeans, rather than unilateral American national security action. Part of it has been the attitude towards the Palestinian issue, namely considering the Palestinian issue a central element, if not the central element, in the context of Israel-Arab conflict or the attempts to produce Israel-Arab peace treaties. And this has been the worldview of the State Department, basically. This has been the worldview behind litany of State Department peace initiatives, which have failed systematically. And they failed systematically because they have focused on the Palestinian issue rather than on Arab interest. The fact is that the Abraham Accord, as well as the Israeli peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, bypassed the Palestinian issue, and therefore they came to fruition. Currently, we hear similar messages from Washington, from Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, referring to the potential of Israeli-Saudi peace treaty, provided, so thanks Secretary Blinken, provided that Israel commits itself to very dramatic concessions to the Palestinians, and thus completely ignoring the order of national priorities upheld by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, which has a very specific order of priority. It does not include the Palestinian issue, and if at all there is a reference, it's anywhere from indifferent reference to negative reference to the Palestinians. The Saudis were the major engine behind Israel's peace treaty with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, as well as Morocco and Sudan. And those peace treaties were signed by denying the Palestinians the veto power which the State Department accords them, and therefore they succeeded. And currently, I believe the State Department is trying once again to bring back the Palestinian issue to center stage of the Arab-Israeli peacemaking, while the Saudis limit their support of the Palestinians to very, very embracing and generous talk, but the walk, the Saudi walk, is absolutely different. And to sum up, I would say that while the State Department accords the Palestinians red carpet reception when they come to Washington in Saudi Arabia and other Arab capitals, the Palestinians get shabby doormat. And the question is, when will the State Department realize the reasons behind that doormat?
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Again, bringing a perspective from across the pond, as they say, but I think underscoring a point that I know is going to be a leitmotif of this program, as it is in previous of these webinars, namely the sort of confirmation, if you will, of Einstein's famous adage that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. And yet that seems to sum up pretty nicely what the United States State Department has been doing for decades now. A woman who has both chronicled this sorry state of affairs, offered some very creative alternatives to it, and is keenly attuned to both the US policy dynamic and its repercussions in the region, specifically inside Israel, is our next presenter. Her name is Carolyn Glick. I'm proud to say she is a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy, and well, so many other things. A commentator for Jewish News Syndicate on Middle East affairs, foreign affairs. She is a contributor to the Channel 14 in Israel. She has been published widely in columns in Newsweek and elsewhere, as well as in two very important books, Shackled Warrior and The Israeli Solution. Always delighted to have her with us for these programs, but especially at a moment such as this, when we're witnessing conversations taking place between senior level US government officials and their Israeli counterparts against the backdrop of now increasing conversations and demagoguery about popular revolts, if not actual civil war inside Israel. An unimaginable prospect, but one that I fear is being encouraged, at least implicitly, by the US government's hostility towards the new government of Israel. Carolyn Glick, as always, welcome to these programs. I know you've had to jam this into a very busy day. We so appreciate you participating. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's always a pleasure to participate in these important events that the Center for Security Policy organizes. So I think that the main thing that we should look at, or let me just look at two things. One is, as you mentioned, Frank, the domestic political situation in Israel and what's driving it. And then I want to move for a second really to the big challenge of the Israeli American relations vis-a-vis the Biden administration in the coming months and perhaps next 2 years. And so with relation to what's happening in Israel, you're right. My column that I think was going to be coming out on Jewish News Syndicate, where I serve as a senior contributing editor tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest, talks specifically about what the Israeli political opposition writ large, our deep state, our media, and our opposition leaders in the Knesset are doing and why they're doing it. And indeed, you're right. Everybody from former prime minister or caretaker prime minister and opposition leader Yair Lapid and his coalition or his opposition partners in the various opposition parties of the left and the center left as well as former Supreme Court President Aaron Barak, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, three former IDF chiefs of general staff, and others are indeed stoking the flames of civil war, calling for civil war, using incendiary rhetoric, calling for civil insurrections and other over-the-top language. They had one major rally last week, and these are organized by the U.S.-based New Israel Fund, which is a foundation primarily funded by progressive American Jews. But they expect to have a much larger demonstration this week where all of the opposition leaders are planning to attend. And they're making a real push to get everybody out, or as many people out as they possibly can. Because as Barak said, these are emergency call-up orders. And if we can get 1 million people into the street, then the evil government will fall. So we haven't really seen anything like this in the past in Israel. And the reason we haven't isn't because the left has suddenly developed a raging hatred for the right. They've had that, really, that's been the background noise of Israeli politics and society since before the founding of the state. And it's a big reason why the majority of Israelis don't believe today that they can trust the left with power, because they're too hateful and contemptuous of voters in the right and religious bloc of parties that is led by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But the reason that this is new, and the reason why they're so riled up and really have crossed the line into almost explicit incitement of civil war, is because they, for the first time, feel that their power is under real threat, and I'll explain. When Menachem Begin, who was the head of the historic head of Likud and founder of the Likud party, first was elected to lead a government in 1977 after continuous rule of Israel by the Labor Party from Israel's founding in 1948-49 through that time. The left developed a coping mechanism and a means for maintaining ultimate power in Israel, regardless of the results of the Knesset elections, which was they moved the center of power away from the Knesset and the government, which are run by Israel's elected leaders, and to what you guys call the deep state, the unelected bureaucracy, and particularly the Supreme Court of Israel. And over the successive decades, and particularly beginning in the 1990s and 2000s under former Supreme Court President Aaron Barak, Israel underwent what has been referred to lovingly by Barak and his associates as a judicial revolution. They absconded actually with the executive and legislative powers of the Knesset and of the government by judicial fiat. They eliminated standing rules and enabled a very large number of foreign government-funded and foreign foundation-funded NGOs to effectively carry out a form of lawfare against the state of Israel through the Supreme Court, so that you don't have to have any standing, you don't have to be a party to a dispute in order to petition the Supreme Court. And this state of affairs in Israel has been roundly condemned by top American jurists and judges, from Antonin Scalia and Richard Posner to most recently Richard Epstein, and others who have said that Israel's legal system is really a form of judicial supremacy. Richard Posner referred to it back in about 15 years ago as judicial piracy. And so what we've really seen through this, which took most politicians and the public by surprise, it's fairly clear that the Likud politicians who enabled this weren't entirely clear on what they were doing, or weren't clear at all about what was happening, and they only recognized in retrospect what had been done to them. The public in Israel only turned pretty decisively against the legal fraternity and began issuing clear demands for the reinstitution of democracy in this country with the indictment of Prime Minister Netanyahu ahead of the 2019 elections. That was the first round of elections. And so Netanyahu was indicted, and in 2021, after 4 conclusive rounds of elections, his trial began. And over the past year or so, since his trial has been going on, the charges against him have completely collapsed, and the public has also been made aware of severe systemic and continuous abuses of prosecutorial and investigative powers against the prime minister, his relatives, other defendants, witnesses, key advisors to the prime minister, by the legal fraternity with the support of the media, and the recognition, the very widespread recognition in Israel that the prime minister, a sitting prime minister, was the victim of concocted charges and a witch hunt by the legal fraternity really turned the corner on public sentiment towards our courts and towards our legal fraternity, to the point where we have the lowest level of trust in our Supreme Court of any OECD country. I think 7% of Israelis have high faith in our Supreme Court, and I think 6% have high levels of faith in our Attorney General. So this is a terrible situation, and Netanyahu and his colleagues won a clear majority in the Knesset to enact significant judicial reform to reinstate checks and balances on the court. And the Justice Minister put forward the first stage of his proposed judicial reform last week, and that was really when all hell broke loose. But what we're really seeing is, when they say that this is a war for Israeli democracy, they're absolutely right. And the reason that they're so riled up and are acting so irresponsibly and in such an incendiary manner and dangerous manner, really, is because they believe that this is an existential battle, that if they lose it, and God willing, they will, then they will be out of power. They will have lost the means that they've used to date to coerce right-wing governments to enact their chosen policies from an ideological perspective and a perspective of the preservation of their political power. So that's what's happening in Israel in a nutshell. And in relation to the
Caroline,
Biden administration,
we have to pause. If you will, please, I'm going to come back to you in a Q&A to address the second point, if you would, but I don't want to run out of time to hear our next speaker. So hold the thought, if you would. And thank you for that. It's really, I think, a critical Rosetta Stone for what has been happening in Israel and what is taking place as we speak, to understand what this Supreme Court and legal fraternity operation is all about. So thank you for that. David Wormser is our last presenter for today. He is the director of the Middle East program at the Center for Security Policy. I'm very proud to have him with us. He is informed by a decades of experience at the highest levels of our government, including as a special advisor for the Middle East to the Vice President of the United States for a time, to its National Security Advisor, to Undersecretary of State. He has been a naval intelligence officer, among other things, and is deeply, deeply knowledgeable about both the dynamics that we've discussed to this point, and the role that American policies and perceptions of its policies can have, even when wrongheaded, even when clearly counterproductive, on others in the region, including in Israel, that can make matters considerably worse. And we want David to sort of tie all this together, picking up on Caroline's last point in particular, about the extent to which this kind of, well, to use the phrase, insurrectionist agitation by essentially the who's who of the left and the opposition in Israel is really being encouraged, again, as I said earlier, implicitly, if not explicitly, by the policies, by the rhetoric, by the attitudes of our own government, and how that's playing into other dynamics as well, notably that of Jordan vis-a-vis Jerusalem, the Saudis vis-a-vis China, and more. So, David Warnzer, over to you, sir.
Thanks. It reminds me a little bit of Little League when I was always the fifth hitter behind the cleanup hitter. And Carolyn, Yoram did such a great job. They really did cover. They cleared the bases. But let me pick up a bit on where Carolyn left off, which is this legal reform. In many ways, Israel and America now are on parallel tracks. That there is a threat to the structure of the United States and a threat to the structure of Israel coming from a left that is increasingly intolerant of being out of power and intolerant of those who disagree with them. As far as the legal case, going on to the level of theory, the Israeli system is essentially a mess, needs reform. Everybody agrees with that. The Israeli legal system, certain other things too. But where do you turn to define your change? Of course, the Israeli right has turned to the United States and looked at our system and our traditions and is beginning to introduce into Israeli legal reform various principles that are borrowed from the United States. So in many ways, criticism of the reform is to some extent a criticism of American legal principles. The second thing that's important to understand is that the Israeli move toward essentially sovereignty lying in the courts and not in the Knesset, in the parliament, in the people, is that it's a European concept. It follows the European view that there is sort of a code of justice or a code of morality, and that all legal processes have to be in reference to that code of morality. And then all governmental processes are then supervised by the courts in order to ensure the implementation of that moral code. That's really the way the European Court of Justice operates. So Israel's Supreme Court looks to the European Court of Justice for guidance and for sort of a foundation, a beacon, a reference point, touchstone for how it should operate and what it should do. And the problem is that there's no legal basis for them to do that. Israel is not a French or European colonial remnant. It didn't emerge from European colonies. It emerged from British power and British colony. But essentially, that means that Israeli law, if it is to look abroad for any guidance and precedent, it has to be based on British law. And British law ultimately is based on the same structure that American law is based on. The Petition of Right, the Bill of Rights, the 1628 Petition of Rights, the 1689 Bill of Rights, exactly the same thing the United States has. Our Bill of Rights was essentially a copy or a conscious reiteration of the British Foundation. So if the court is going to look for some precedential-based guidance or beacon to ground Israel's non-constitutional being, it should look to that. And that's essentially what you see in the legal reforms. But what the real issue is exactly what Carolyn is saying, which is the legal system, the top level of the officer corps in Israel, the educational system, and to some extent the cultural system in Israel is ultimately still a remnant of the early days of the state. It is where the left, which cannot win elections anymore, even the last election, they didn't win. They only managed to get a right-wing party to go their side. And there are two other right-wing parties who are considered now center-left, but really their foreign policy views tend to be more toward the center-right. So essentially, they can't win elections anymore. So they've retreated into this vanguard idea that somehow, the European base of justice, which you have a vanguard enlightened elite that holds the key power structures under its control, that keeps an eye and supervises the wayward Israeli people or the wayward masses from being able to exercise their power and exercise their judgment. This is a very, this is Robespierre, this is the left, this is the foundation of leftist thought, that there's a sort of a vanguard enlightened elite. So that's the structure. So to break that, to begin to reform it, obviously threatens the very existence of the left's power and continued power, because they cannot win elections. But what's happened is also that these structures have become entirely divorced from the realities in Israel, whether it's ethnic realities, religious, just Israeli society has developed 70 years now. It's reawakened things, it's created new things that have nothing to do with the elites that control these power structures. So you see this vast chasm. So that's sort of the nature of the fight over this legal reform. Now, the demonstrations, I think, kind of reveal this, because we just had an election 2 months ago. These demonstrations aren't meant to show that, quote, they have the street. The street spoke. It spoke 2 months ago, and it made itself very clear. It is for these sorts of reforms, and it has been for a while, because they've been watching the complete collapse of control of the streets in Israel, whether it's crime, whether it's terrorism, whether it's mafioso-like activity. Israel's losing control of its streets, and people feel it. And they're wondering why the legal system stands in the way of judgments and so forth. A good example that was a lightning that hit everybody was a 10-year-old girl was raped in the South by a gang of Bedouin that invaded their house and raped her. And the legal system delivered a non-sentence, basically a suspended sentence on that. And that shocked Israelis, that the government, the legal structure was not protecting them. So that drove home the point of the chasm between the legal elites, the legal fraternity, and frankly, you see it also in the military side and in the education side, and the people. So these demonstrations now are taking place. They can't claim that they represent the street because they lost the election. So I think what you have here is essentially the delegitimization of Israel. And they understand they have foreigners in Europe and in the United States who are behind them. Now, that's where I want to turn before I conclude, which is, I think Doug got it right to some extent about the United States. Certainly, Yoram, I think you hit it much more on, but I would go even a step further. I think that what you're seeing in the United States right now is ultimately the battle between the progressive left and the old school liberals. The old school liberals are weak, and they feel that they have to give the progressives a lot of things. And one of the things they gave them is to staff out foreign policy to progressives. Progressives are irreconcilable with Israel. They're inherently hostile. And the left essentially is allowing that to happen. The left, center left is allowing that to happen, believing that it's a freebie. Under the previous Israeli government, essentially it was a freebie. You could avoid the overt visible fights between the United States and Israel because the Israelis just didn't respond. Even though there were considerably hostile actions by under the previous administration in Israel by the United States. But now I think what you're heading toward is a moment where the center left in America is going to be forced to choose. That it either has to maintain its more traditional sympathy toward Israel, tempered by the peace process, tempered by some ideas of arms control that informed the Iran policy, but nevertheless, in their guts, still somewhat pro-Israeli, and the progressive left, which essentially staffs out our foreign policy and is inherently hostile to Israel, does not see Iran ultimately as a threat, hates the Saudi Arabian government, dislikes the Abraham Accords for various reasons, and in general has globally sided with the old radical left, and Israel stands in that way. So I think now you're seeing a situation where we're headed for a clarification, where there's no way that you're not going to have some sort of an American-Israeli showdown, and it's going to clarify where the left stands and who on the left stands with Israel and against Israel. And to some extent, there's a parallel thing going on the right, where you have an increasing crowd which is hostile to any foreign engagement. And I think that they'll be called out. I think it's a less serious fissure, and it doesn't affect Israel quite as much, but it's there. But the big showdown right now, I think, is between essentially the center left and the far progressive left in the United States. And right now, the progressive left, I think, runs foreign policy because it was a freebie to give them by the center left. And I think now we're headed for a showdown on that. And it will take place over the issues of Jerusalem. It'll take place over the issues of construction settlements. It'll take place over legal reform, because that legal reform resonates with American legal questions and the attempted transformation of the United States legal structures as well over the last decades. So I think what you're seeing is a very it is now part of internal American politics, what is happening in Israel. And I think that's why it's going to become very messy. But Israel, I think, is headed in a clear direction. It hasn't returned a left government in a long time for real. And I don't think that ultimately the United States will do itself well by creating such horrible tension with its ally.
David, thank you. A very elegant way to complete this panel by emphasizing the internal dynamics of the United States and how they are bearing on the now increasingly fraught ones inside Israel. We're going to take a round or two of questions and responses from our panelists now. I want to just thank each of you for having, I think, laid out powerfully elements of a larger challenge that we're facing, which I think is the sort of the role of the United States in the world more generally, but specifically in the Middle East at the moment. It is clearly inflaming tensions rather than contributing to stability. Carolyn, I guess maybe I would start with you to talk a little bit about how all of this is being perceived within the Palestinian community, both in Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, as well as in Gaza, of course, but Israel proper within the so-called Green Line.
I suppose that you could say that they're saying, "Oh, the Jews are tearing each other apart. Let's take out some popcorn and chomp down." But I mean, I think that one of the things that you talked about Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again. But I think that that sort of gives people the benefit of the doubt that certainly at this point they definitely don't deserve. And I think that, in the 1940s, after the Holocaust, the Soviets invented the concept of anti-Zionism as a way to kosher anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. And so the Jews became Zionists, and Zionist was a code word for being Jewish, and so they got to be anti-Zionist, and that was a way to make it socially acceptable to be anti-Semitic after the Holocaust. And I think that the concept two-state solution has, in a way, taken on a similar code meaning for people who proclaim that it's a be-all and end-all of their vision for the Middle East, because at this point it's very difficult to claim innocence and not understand that there is no constituency within the Palestinian body politic, such as it is, that supports statehood of a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel at peace. And the constituency, such as it is among Israel's Arab citizens for such a solution, so-called, is also dwindling, as the presence of the PLO-controlled Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria on the one hand, and the Hamas-controlled statelet of Gaza on the other hand, have massively expanded the irredentism and anti-Semitism and rejection of Israel's right to exist among Israel's Arab citizens, as we saw in the Arab pogroms against Jewish Israelis in mixed Arab-Israeli cities and towns and on highways during the May 2021 Hamas missile onslaught against Israel. So I think that what the two-state solution has come to mean is it's become the nomenclature of an anti-Israel policy that you can adopt safely without being referred to as anti-Israel. But you are in fact, and you knowingly are anti-Israel. So I think, was it Tom Nides, I believe, gave an interview to Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox magazine called Hamishpacha last week. And the writer asked him why he thought that there would be peace when 71% of Palestinians, under some recent survey, I think by Khalil Shkaki, said that they oppose the two-state solution and support terrorism against Israel. And Tom Nides repeated the claim that the proportion of Palestinians who support terrorism is extremely small, and the Palestinian Authority wants peaceful coexistence with Israel. And there are literally mountains of evidence that prove incontrovertibly that this is simple nonsense, that the vast majority of Palestinians support terrorism against Israel. The Palestinian Authority, its main characteristic is it supports sponsorship and financing and celebration of terrorism against Israel and incitement of Israel's annihilation now for the past 30 years in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. So this is an utter lie. And yet the Biden administration continues to push it. So when you look at a society that defines itself, it defines itself by its hatred for Israel. And its job in the world is to destroy Israel first and foremost before even thinking about what to do with the territory on which Israel now stands. And it's very clear how these people would look at anything that they believe contributes to the societal destruction and suicide of Israel. They're very happy about it. Having said that, and going back to what David was saying, I think it's very important to understand that the struggle here between the Israeli left, which has become increasingly radicalized since the destruction, the Palestinians destroyed the so-called peace process and opened a terrorist war against Israel in September 2000. I think it's very important to understand that this is a war about the future of Israel. And is Israel going to remain the nation state of the Jewish people, or is it not? And it's very clear that the majority of Israelis want Israel to continue as a nation state of the Jewish people. There was a momentary, or it lasted for 2 years, question mark about the right religious bloc's ability to continue governing. That was inserted into the equation by the legal fraternity through its witch hunt of Netanyahu. But because their case against Netanyahu has completely fallen apart, they are no longer able to maintain a shattering or a splintering of the right religious bloc. The people who are on the right went home and voted for one of the 4 parties who were running in the bloc in the November 1st elections, and that is why they received the majority of support. Israelis have chosen that we want to safeguard and preserve our country. And so I think we are in for a difficult ride. I see headlines yesterday indicating that the Biden administration is working with Moody's to try to lower Israel's credit rating over the efforts to reform the judiciary, which will be interesting. So, there are a lot of things that the Americans can do, and there are many things that they may do in order to undermine Israel. But at the end of the day, I think that, we'll will endure and will move forward. And I hope very much that the Americans are going to be forced to reckon with the fact that they're doing something incredibly stupid. And hopefully the Republicans in Congress will be able to make that very clear.
Thank you. I have to say, I take heart from your comment that the case against Benjamin Netanyahu has fallen apart. I was not aware of that. If that's so, then it makes all the more reckless the aggressiveness of the administration, and I think you've introduced another data point in that aggressiveness with this comment about a run at Moody's and the creditworthiness of the Jewish state. Let me come back to you, if I may, David Wormser. One of the things that you have warned about, and we mentioned in our press release announcing this program, was the degree to which Jordan is now contributing to this incitement, specifically in connection with the Temple Mount. The man who's being greatly vilified for having visited the Temple Mount, among other things, the minister Gvir, is much in the news in connection with all of this. But talk to us a little bit about what Jordan is doing, what the stakes are for the state of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom, in all of this ferment and dynamic.
Sure. Jordan, it's an interesting case, Jordan, and I think it reveals a lot. It'll affect also the Saudis. I think the Saudis are increasingly seeing it also as a major issue. Jordan, that is. The reason why King Abdullah is doing what he's doing is because he believes that he can succeed and ride a certain degree of popularity and re-moor his kingdom by being the champion of Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. This is something that has been tried a few times by his father, King Hussein. Each time led to a catastrophic collapse and grave existential threat to the kingdom that demanded a foreign intervention to save it. Whether it was Black September in 1970 or whether it was earlier ones in 58, the U.S. Marines going to Beirut. There's all these cases where King Hussein of Jordan tried to incorporate Palestinian nationalism into the identity to sort of bridge the twin pillars of Jordan. But in the end, it all failed because it threatened his regime, and he understood by the end that he needed essentially the tribes, the old Hijazi. The Hijaz is southern Jordan, northern Saudi Arabia. His regime was a tribal regime, which stood opposed to Palestinian Arab nationalism. So in the end, that's how he survived. His son is making the mistake he made, except unlike his father, the son has no currency with the tribes. He doesn't speak Arabic very well. He never goes and meets with the tribal leaders in the south. So he is trying to re-moor everything. He's throwing all the eggs on the Palestinian basket, which will consume his regime and ultimately, I fear, bring it down. The second thing about Jerusalem is that the peace treaty, Article 9 and 10 of the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, one needs to remember the word status quo is never written in the peace treaty. This whole idea that it's part of the peace treaty, the historic status quo, not in the peace treaty, nowhere to be found. What is there is to recognize Jordan's historical role in Jerusalem. Now, the reason why the Israelis did it was a Jordanian request, because when Israel signed the peace treaty with the Palestinians, or the Oslo agreement that was anything but a peace treaty, with the Palestinians, the Jordanians freaked out because King Hussein understood that Palestinian nationalism was a threat. And if the Palestinians gain control of Jerusalem, it's the end of Jordan, essentially. So he asked Rabin, and he negotiated with them to ensure that Jerusalem, ultimately, his interests are preserved against the PLO, against the Palestinians. because just before that, the Israeli government sort of lost focus and allowed Ikrim al-Sabri to become the head of the religious authority in Jerusalem. Ikrim al-Sabri was a radical Palestinian nationalist aligned with the PLO. So that's where that whole role of Jordan in Jerusalem comes from. It's an anti-PLO clause in the peace treaty. So now King Abdullah of Jordan is trying to make it an avenue for championing Palestinian rights, which undermines completely the strategic purpose of those clauses, and frankly undermines what the point was of the Jordanian peace treaty as it applied to Jerusalem. So I fear this is not going to end well. The United States is using this as a wedge issue between itself and Israel, and between Israel and the Jordanians. It deliberately is trying to isolate Israel, I believe, on this issue, and try to essentially prove to the Israelis that their radicalism, namely the assertion that Jews have a right to visit their holiest site, is a radical act that will destroy peace. So again, the progressives here are using these issues to drive wedges between Israel and the United States and remoor Israeli-American relations onto a hostile foundation. The Saudis are increasingly worried about the survival of Jordan. So this is a strategic area where, again, I think the Israelis and Saudis will quietly behind the scenes have to work it out.
Well, and David, that's exactly where I wanted to go next with Yoram Ettinger. Yoram, you've studied closely the House of Saud and its policy machinations, survival being uppermost in their mind, understandably. But it animates both their attitude towards Iran, which seeks their destruction, obviously, their attitude towards the government of Israel. You mentioned, I think, the role that they played behind the Abraham Accords. How does the Saudis see what's going on here? They've got their own issues, of course, with the Biden administration, but to the extent that the Biden team is trying to tell them they have to get behind the idea of the Palestinians as once again the arbiter of Israel's relations with the region, and for that matter, sort of stability and peace in the region more broadly. How is this being seen from Riyadh at the moment, as you see it?
My mind, the Saudi issue has to do with the clash of civilizations, which has taken place both in the US as well as in Israel, namely the clash between those who stick with reality, as inconvenient, as frustrating, bloody, intolerant as it is. Still, we have to work with reality in the Middle East and elsewhere. And then the other school of thought, which is addicted to convenience, peace at any price, and also addicted to the illusion that the West can export its values of peaceful coexistence and democracy and human rights to the Arab world, to the Muslim world, irrespective of systematic failures to do just that. When it comes to the Saudis, David mentioned, rightly so, that they are very concerned about Jordan and the Jordanian-Palestinian connection. The Saudis are very much aware to a fact which has been absent from the calculations or the policy of State Department in the Middle East. The Saudis are aware that should there be a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River, it would doom the Hashemites east of the Jordan River. And once you doom the Hashemites east of the Jordan River, any substitute would be either would be either worse or worst or dramatically worse than the Hashemites as far as Middle East stability, as far as American interest in the Middle East, because once the Hashemites are toppled through a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River, it's a question of time. It may be days, it may be weeks, it may be months before there is a ripple effect from non-Hashemite Jordan into the Arabian Peninsula, toppling series of pro-American Sunni Arab regimes with the help of the Ayatollahs, with the help of the Muslim Brotherhood, which could trigger also economic crisis, major economic crisis, with a transfer of the control over the major sources of natural gas and oil in the Persian Gulf from pro-American entities to anti-American entities, let alone the impact of non-Hashemite Jordan upon the proliferation of terrorism. A non-Hashemite Jordan would become another Libya, another Syria, another Iraq, another Yemen. Jordan, the Hashemites of Jordan, want to become increasingly similar to the United Arab Republic, to United Arab Emirates. But that would be an impossibility with the toppling of the Hashemites. The bottom line is we're talking here about the conflict between State Department conventional wisdom and Middle East reality. The Saudis are in touch with reality. President Sisi of Egypt is in touch with reality. Sadly, the foreign policy establishment in Washington at this stage, and for good intentions, however, it is out of touch with reality, which could be a most self-destructive state of mind when it comes to America's best interests.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I think we're going to have to wrap it with this. I just want to emphasize a point that several of you have made. What is being done, whether it's the State Department's conventional wisdom, as you put it, Yoram, whether it's the progressives are now being given their head in terms of running American foreign policy, whether it is misbegotten inclinations of this president, whether it is a function of a deep desire to weaken America and its friends, or a combination of all of the above, or maybe even all of the above that are operating here. One thing seems clear from what we've discussed. This is a terrible time for the United States government to be exhibiting hostility towards the government of Israel, both for what it translates into in terms of the internal, increasingly dangerous circumstances inside the Jewish state, and what that means for the rest of the region. And I think your point that the prospects here are that those who are hostile to the United States will benefit. Those who are friendly to the United States will suffer, or worse in a way, cut their losses by making separate peaces with their enemies and ours, is all devastatingly foolish and dangerous. And I'm fond of a comment that Carolyn Glick usually makes. I don't think she did in this course, so let me say it. If you treat your enemies better than your friends, you will have more enemies and fewer friends. And that may or may not be something that jives with the State Department's conventional wisdom, but it is reality. And if we are not attentive to the reality at this particular moment in time, in this particular region, we will, I fear, reap the whirlwind, among others. I want to thank each of our speakers, former Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith, appreciate very much him participating, albeit by video. Carolyn Glick, wonderful ally and friend and colleague at the Center for Security Policy, Ambassador Yoram Ediger, a really accomplished, seasoned, and extremely thoughtful diplomat by training. And of course, David Wormser, our Director of Middle East Policy at the Center for Security Policy. Thanks for the cumulative experience that you bring to bear and having brought it to bear so effectively in the course of this conversation. We're very appreciative. And we hope that those of you who have listened, we had a number of questions. We got to one or two of them, but there could have been many more. But we'll continue to be holding these programs and hope that you will continue to tune into them to shed light on what is at stake and what we best be doing about it in the Middle East in the days to come. From all of us at the Center for Security Policy, please make use of this video, which will be posted shortly at securefreedom.org. And as I'm fond of saying, go forth and multiply.